Welcome back. Tonight we travel to Noxus, an old empire on the continent of Valoran, built long ago upon a single belief that strength is the only thing that truly lasts. There is nothing here to follow closely, and nothing that can be missed. There are no twists waiting, and no questions to answer. This is only an old story told slowly, the way such stories were once told beside a low fire to a room already growing drowsy. So there is nothing to do now but settle in and let the eyes close whenever they wish to, and let the story drift along on its own, wherever it cares to go. We begin a very long time ago, more than 15 centuries before the empire we are speaking of would take its modern shape, in an age so old that almost nothing certain remains of it. In that distant age, before there was any nation called Noxus, the central lands of Valoran were hard country, wind-scoured and often barren, hemmed in the north by the Iron Spike Mountains and ringed elsewhere by older ranges whose names have faded. The people of that country were many small tribes, and among them were the tribes called the Noxi, who would in time lend their name to everything that came after. And yet, before any of that, there was a warlord. His name in life was San Uzal. He was a chieftain of the Noxi, a barbarian of that hard country, and it was said that he conquered a great portion of Valoran in his mortal years, driven by a single hunger, which was to earn a place at the table of the gods themselves. He wished, when he died, to be welcomed among the great and the honored. And so he fought and conquered and gathered all his life, certain that such a reward was waiting. When at last he died, there was no table, and there were no gods to greet him. There was only an empty afterlife, a gray and quiet nowhere, with nothing in it that he had been promised. And in that emptiness, rather than rest, San Uzal turned his great will toward learning. He listened. He learned the language of the dead, an old tongue called Oknun, and across the veil that separates the living from the lost, he began to call out, patiently, for a very long time. Far away, in the world he had left, a coven of sorcerers heard that calling and answered it. They raised him back across the veil, drawing his soul into a suit of dark armor that they had prepared, an immense and terrible shell of black iron. And when he stood again, in that armor, he was no longer only San Uzal. He had become something new, and the name the world would give him was Mordekaiser, the Iron Revenant, the one who had returned in iron from beyond death. His first act upon returning was a cold one, told here plainly and then set gently aside. The sorcerers who had raised him expected to command him, and instead he slew them, and from their souls he forged a great mace, which he named Nightfall. It is a dark beginning, and we will not dwell in it. We need only know that he kept it and carried it through all the long age that followed. With his armor and his mace and his knowledge of the realms beyond death, Mordekaiser set out to take the world a second time. He reconquered much of Valoran, more thoroughly than he had in life, and where he ruled, the living and the dead served him alike. He bound demons to his will, old and hungry things with names like Atakan and Tybalk, and he kept them as one might keep hounds. He captured a small magical creature, a yordle named Vaegr, and set him to grinding out enchantments without end. And to be the seat of this empire of death, Mordekaiser raised, in the central lands, a great fortress. That fortress was the immortal Bastion. It was built by his command in that far distant age, a dark and looming structure meant to stand forever, and in a sense it has. Everything that Noxus would later become would grow up around it, and beneath it, and in its long shadow. And yet all of that is far ahead of us. For now there was only the Iron Revenant in his bastion, ruling a death empire across the central lands of Valoran, and it was said that his reign lasted almost 3 centuries. 3 centuries is a long time, longer than most empires of the living ever last, and for all of it, the land lay under his cold order. He did not age, for he was already past death. He did not tire. He simply ruled and gathered and waited, much as he had always done, only now there was no table of the gods left to hope for, and so the gathering had become its own slow purpose. In time, even that long reign came to its end. He was defeated, at last, by an alliance of the Noxus tribes, the very people he had once led in life, who rose together against the thing he had become. The old records say only that though it took almost 3 centuries, he was eventually defeated by an alliance of the Noxus tribes, and the tribes did not act entirely alone. 2 members of his own inner circle turned against him. The first was a sorceress of illusions, a woman called LeBlanc, whose true age no one knows, and whose name, it is said, was only one of many she had worn across the years. The second was a blood mage and aristocrat named Vladimir, who had learned the old magic of flesh and blood and had stretched his own life far past its natural span. These 2 had stood close to the Iron Revenant, and these 2 betrayed him. Working together with the tribes, they did not destroy him, for such a thing may not have been possible. Instead, they severed his soul from the dark armor, and they sealed it away, and they let the great empty shell of him fall still. And so the Iron Revenant passed out of the world, though not, as we will see much later, forever. His soul withdrew to a distant spirit realm, a quiet place called Mitna Rachnun, where it remained, gathering strength in no particular hurry, the way deep water gathers behind a dam, with all the patience of something that has already waited 300 years and is willing to wait far longer. We will leave him there, in that far, quiet realm, and return to the living world, which now had a great empty fortress standing in its heart, and a scattering of weary tribes around it. In the long age that followed his fall, the world was not gentle. There were older wars still burning across Valoran, wars whose names have come down to us only faintly. The last of the ancient rune wars and a great conflict called the Darken War, in which terrible weapons and terrible beings tore at one another across the land. The Noxus tribes, who had just unmade their old master, found themselves in a ruined country with enemies on every side, and so they did the sensible thing. They sheltered. They went into the immortal bastion, the very fortress that Mordekaiser had raised to rule them, and they made it their refuge. Its walls were thick and old and made for war, and within them the tribes endured, through the worst of those ancient wars, while the world outside burned itself down and slowly cooled. They waited there, generation upon generation, until at last the great wars guttered out, and it grew safe enough to come out again into the open. It is worth resting a moment in that long sheltering, for it was one of the quietest and longest of all the Empire's hidden eras, and it shaped everything that followed. Imagine the inside of that great dark fortress through those years, full of the tribes who had taken refuge in it, living their whole lives within its thick old walls while the world outside tore itself apart. Children were born in the bastion who would grow old and die in it, having never once walked in open country, knowing only the corridors and the halls and the high dim chambers of the fortress that had become their world. They kept their old ways alive in there, their stories and their crafts and their quarrels, the whole life of a people folded up inside stone, waiting out an age of fire. And slowly, over those long, sheltered generations, the separate tribes who had come in began to become one people, bound together by the shared walls and the shared waiting and the shared memory of the thing they had unmade to win those walls. By the time it was safe to come out, they were no longer quite the tribes who had gone in. They had become, in the long, dark patience of that waiting, the first Noxians, though they did not yet have the name. And then, at last, the day came when the watchers on the walls saw that the fires beyond the horizon had died down, that the great wars had finally spent themselves, that it was safe to open the gates. Imagine that first emergence, after generations within, the gates of the immortal bastion swinging open and the people walking out, blinking, into open daylight and open air, onto a ruined and emptied land that was nonetheless free of the old fires at last. It must have been a strange and solemn thing, that coming out, a whole people stepping back into a world their grandparents had fled, to begin again on broken ground. And on that broken ground, under that open sky, they made their choice to remain one people, and took their name, and became Noxus. When they emerged, the land they found was poor and broken and surrounded by potential foes, and the tribes, who had survived only by standing together inside those walls, made a decision that would shape everything afterward. They would not scatter back into separate peoples. They would remain one. They took for themselves a single name, drawn from the old Noxii, and they called themselves Noxus. From the very first, Noxus was built around a hard and simple idea, born from everything its founders had lived through. They had seen that weakness invited ruin, that a divided and gentle people in a hostile land would simply be swallowed. And so they decided that strength would be their first article of faith, the one currency that could keep a people alive when the world around them wished them gone. Expansion was not, at the start, ambition so much as survival. To stop growing was to be surrounded and crushed. To grow was to live. There is one more thing that took shape in those founding days. Quietly, in the shadows where almost no one ever looked. LeBlanc and Vladimir, the sorceress and the blood mage who had helped unmake the Iron Revenant, did not simply fade into the new nation. They formed between them a secret pact, and from that pact grew a hidden society that would come to be called the Black Rose. Its stated purpose, deep down, was to watch for any sign that the Iron Revenant might one day return, and to prevent it. And yet, almost from the beginning, it became something else as well. A cabal of aristocrats and mages and high figures who worked behind the throne of the young empire, guiding it and steering it for reasons of their own. From the founding onward then, Noxus had two histories running side by side, the loud one written in its wars and its laws, and the quiet one written in shadow by the Black Rose. And for a very long time, hardly anyone knew that the second history existed at all. And so the young empire began to grow, slowly at first, outward from the bastion and the central lands, in every direction the country allowed. The tribes had become a nation, and the nation became a state with armies, and the armies pressed against the lands around them. And where they pressed, the borders moved. In those early generations, there lived a warrior whose name was Scion, and he belonged to what the old accounts call the last of a proud warrior culture that defined early Noxus. He was a hero of that culture, a man of enormous strength and unbending will, and in time he rose to hold the title of Hand of Noxus, which was given to the one who led the Empire's armies in the field. Under Scion, the Empire drove its expansion westward, toward the green and ordered lands that another people had claimed and meant to defend. that other people were the Dalmatians, and they would become, over the centuries, the great rival of Noxus, the mirror held up to everything Noxus believed. Where Noxus prized strength and the freedom of the strong to rise, Dalmatia prized order and law and the protection of the whole. Two such peoples, pressing against the same frontier, were always going to come to blows, and they did. The war reached its turning point on the southern Argent Mountain frontier, near a settlement called Vardis, more than a century before the modern age we are slowly moving toward. There, the Noxian advance under Sion met the Dalmatian defense led by their king, a man named Jarvan, the first of that name to be called Lightshield. The battle was hard, as such battles are, and we need not linger over its blood. What matters is its ending, which is one of the oldest and most retold stories in all of Noxus. At a certain point in the fighting, one of Sion's own commanders turned to retreat, and Sion, who did not understand retreat, would not allow it. And then the great warrior closed with King Jarvan himself. The two met in the press of the battle, and Sion took the king in one hand and strangled him, even as Dalmatian blades found Sion and struck him down. They died, in effect, in the same moment, the king of Dalmatia and the hand of Noxus, locked together, neither willing to release the other. When the Noxians gathered up their fallen hero to carry him home, they found that his hand still held the crown of the slain king. They did not pry it loose. They bore his body all the long way back to the immortal bastion, with the enemy king's crown still clutched in his grip, and there they laid him to rest inside a great monument raised in his honor, a towering tomb within the city itself. And the day of that killing became a holiday in Noxus, observed every year, a quiet point of pride that endured long after the man himself was gone. We will return to Sion much later, for his story does not in fact end with his death, but for now we leave him at rest, entombed beneath his own statue, the crown of a king still in his stone-still hand, and a war begun that would simmer between two nations for 100 years and more. In time, the loud history of the empire passed into the hands of its emperors, and the last of them, the one whose long reign carries us toward the modern age, was a man named Boram Darkwill. He was born to one of the great houses of Noxus, and he rose to the throne with the backing of the old noble families, and also, though few knew it, with the quiet backing of the Black Rose in the shadows behind them. He took the title of Grand General, which by then meant the head of both the state and the armies, and for many years he ruled, and for a good while he ruled well. In his early years, Darkwill was a capable and energetic ruler, and the empire grew under him. He pushed the borders south, all the way to the great range called the Great Barrier, and he turned back the early raids of the Dalmatians who pressed from the west. He brought new peoples into the empire, among them the great horned Minotaur clans of the borderlands, whose warriors were folded into the armies. And when he needed soldiers, he found them wherever he could. He conscripted the orphans of conquered cities, and he gathered what the old accounts call soldiers of misfortune, the fighters of the arenas and the prisoners of the cells, and he sent them to fill the gaps in his war hosts. It was harsh, and it was effective, and for a long span of years, the empire was the stronger for it. It was during Darkwill's reign that one of the strangest and saddest chapters of the empire unfolded, and it concerns the warrior Sion, whom we left entombed beneath his statue. For half a century, more or less, Sion had simply lain there, dead and honored, a hero turned to monument. And yet the empire, in the middle of Darkwill's reign, began to feel the first chill of decline, and Darkwill, looking for any advantage, allowed the Black Rose to attempt something that perhaps should not have been attempted. They would bring the old hero back. Using the blood magic of Vladimir, the ancient hemomancer who had helped found their cabal, the Black Rose reached into that half-century of death and dragged Sion back into his body. And the thing that rose was not the hero they remembered. It was something half-aware and uncontrollable, a great engine of violence that did not know friend from foe, that killed whatever came near it without preference or pause. They had wanted a weapon and had woken a storm. There was nothing to be done with him but to bind him again, and so the reanimated Sion was wrapped in chains and sealed away once more, a hero twice removed from rest. We will hear, near the very end of our story, what eventually became of him. But for now he sleeps again in his chains, and we let him sleep. The other great undertaking of Darkwill's later reign was the one that would bring the whole imperial order down, though no one saw it that way at the time. Darkwill had grown old, and as he aged he grew obsessed with the thing all great rulers come to fear, which is the ending of their own power and of themselves. He came to believe that somewhere in the eastern lands, in the islands and provinces of a place called Ionia, there lay artifacts of immortality, old magics that might let him cheat death and rule forever. And so he ordered the invasion of Ionia, and he sent his war hosts across the water to take that distant land and to search it for the thing he wanted. What he did not fully understand, in his age and his obsession, was how far the Black Rose had wound itself back into his court and into him. The sorceress LeBlanc, who had once been rooted out of the cabal and had faked her own death to escape, had quietly returned. Over the slow years, she worked her way back to the aging emperor's side, and she nurtured his fears and his obsessions, and it is said she poisoned and aged him further, steering the proud old ruler ever deeper into madness and ruin. The empire was, by the end of his reign, ruled in name by a failing emperor, and in truth, in no small part, by the shadow at his shoulder. And far to the east, across the water, the invasion he had ordered was about to go very wrong, in ways that would send their consequences echoing all the way back to the throne. And that is a chapter of its own, and we will come to it gently, in its turn. And so the story turns east, across the water, to the long and costly invasion of Ionia. Ionia was a land unlike the hard country of Noxus, a place of old magic and quiet shrines, and a people deeply bound to the spirit of their land. The invasion began in a western province called Navori, with raids that were meant both to occupy the country and to search it for the immortality the old emperor craved. At first, the war hosts moved as they always had, taking ground, subduing towns, pressing inward. And yet Ionia did not break the way other lands had broken. Its people gathered themselves slowly and then resisted with a depth and a fury the Noxians had not expected, and the invasion settled into a long, grinding, bitter thing. Among the many figures caught up in that war, there were a few whose stories carry us forward, and we will touch them gently, one at a time. There was a general named Jericho Swain, sent to Ionia by the old emperor. Swain had been born into a patrician house of Noxus, shortly after the nation's founding generations had given way to its settled centuries, and he had risen as a clever and capable officer. He came to Ionia with his war host already worn thin by the long campaign, and at a place called the Placidium of Navori, a central holdout that the Noxians meant to seize, he met disaster. The Ionians ambushed his depleted force, and in the fighting, a young blade dancer named Irelia, scarcely more than a girl, turned upon him. She shattered his knee, and she severed his left arm, and she left him broken on the ground, and the battle was lost. Swain did not die there, though by every reckoning he should have. Crippled and abandoned, he found his way back, and in his ruin he turned toward a thing that few would have dared to touch. Deep beneath the immortal bastion, in the old foundations Mordekaiser had raised, there was bound a demonic entity, an old hungry thing that sometimes wore the shape of a raven. Its name was Raum. Swain, broken and patient and unafraid in the way only the truly determined are, made contact with that entity and bargained with it, and the demon restored to him an arm. From then on, Swain saw the world differently, through eyes that were partly his own and partly something else. And he watched the empire through a flock of ravens, and he began, quietly, to glimpse a far older darkness sleeping in the heart of his nation, though he did not yet understand its name. There was also, in that same war, a young woman named Riven. She had been born far to the west, in a poor farming hamlet called Treval, where the fields clung to rocky hillsides and life was hard and plain. She had grown up believing in Noxus with her whole heart, believing in the promise that anyone with strength and will could rise, no matter how low their birth. She was conscripted as a teenager, and she rose by sheer conviction and ferocity in a unit called the Fury Company, and her belief carried her upward until the old emperor himself recognized her and granted her a great runic blade of dark metal, enchanted by a pale sorceress within his court. To Riven, that sword was the proof of everything she had been told, that the Empire saw her and valued her and would reward what she gave it. She carried that faith and that sword to Ionia, and there, in Navori, her warband was assigned to escort another, a force commanded by a man named Emistan, who had brought with him a mad chemist from the foreign city of Zaun, an alchemist named Singed. The wagons that Riven's people were guarding held containers, and the containers, unknown to most of them, held chemical weapons of a terrible and indiscriminate kind. In an Ionian ambush, the wagons ruptured, the chemicals poured out, and the fire that followed did not care whose side anyone was on. It killed the Ionians, and it killed the Noxians, her own people all together, in a single choking ruin from which her enchanted blade alone preserved her. We state this plainly, and then we move past it, gently, the way one walks quietly past a thing one cannot fix. Riven stood in the aftermath of that night, and understood all at once that this was not the conquest she had believed in. This was extermination, and her own empire had chosen it, had been willing to burn its own loyal soldiers to win. The faith of her whole life broke in that moment. She did not turn against Noxus in rage. She simply could no longer be its weapon. She sought out a Windblade master to shatter the great sword the Empire had given her, the symbol of all she had believed, and in the doing of it, a terrible accident took the life of an old teacher she had not meant to harm. And then she wandered, alone, through the broken country, an exile from the only home she had known, until at last she gave herself up to a Noxian hunting party, neither fighting nor fleeing, simply done. Her story, like so many in this telling, does not have a tidy end. It has only a quieting, a settling into exile, and we leave her there, walking the hills of a foreign land with a broken blade, and we turn back toward the capital. The war in Ionia was long, and many lives passed through it, and we can touch a few more of them gently before we turn back toward the capital. There was the chemist, Singed, a strange and brilliant and terrible man out of the distant city of Zaun, whom the Noxian commander Emistan had brought in to break the long Ionian stalemate. Singed cared nothing for the Empire or its enemies. He cared only for his work, for the chemicals and the reactions and the cold logic of what they could do, and he made for the war weapons of a kind it had not seen. the fire and the poison that did not distinguish between soldiers and turned whole stretches of ground to ruin. We have already seen what his work did to Riven's company, and we will not walk through it again. It is enough to say that he moved through that war like a quiet plague, doing his terrible work without malice and without mercy, simply because the work interested him, and that the Noxians who employed him came to be hated for it even by their own. There was the resistance of the Ionian people themselves, who would not be conquered the way other lands had been conquered. They were a people deeply bound to the spirit of their land, and when the invasion came, they gathered themselves, slowly at first, and then with a deep gathering fury, monks and warriors and ordinary folk taking up the defense of their home. Some among them became famous in the long struggle, names the Ionians would remember long after, fighters who turned the empire back from this shrine or that mountain. The war that Darkwill had thought would be a swift seizing of magical treasure became instead a long grinding bleed, year upon year. The empire pouring in war hosts and the island swallowing them, until even in Noxus it began to be quietly understood that the Eastern War was a wound that would not close. And there was the ending of it, which came not from victory, but from the change at home. Less than a year after Swain took the throne, he looked clearly at the Eastern War, weighed what it was costing against what it could ever win, and did the thing the old emperor had never been able to do. He ended it. He recalled the war hosts from Ionia, called them home across the water, and let the long bleeding stop. It was not a triumph, and it was not framed as one. It was simply a clear-eyed man cutting a loss that should have been cut years before, and in the doing of it, he spared both peoples a great deal of further ruin. The Ionian provinces the empire still held grew quiet and uneasy, and the rest was let go, and the war that had broken Riven and crippled Swain and bled the empire for years simply, at last, stopped. For while the war in Ionia ground on, the true turning of the empire's history was happening at home, in the immortal bastion, where the old emperor sat failing on his shattering throne. Swain, restored and watchful, had returned from the east with a clearer sight than any other living person in Noxus. He saw the rot in Darkwill, the madness fed by the shadow at the old man's shoulder, the long, slow ruin the empire was sliding toward, and he decided in his patient way that it would end. He gathered his allies quietly. Among the most prominent of them was a flamboyant arena fighter named Draven, of whom we will hear more soon. And then, in the space of a single night, Swain moved. The coup against Borum Darkwill was not a long civil war. It was one night. Swain and his allies overthrew the old emperor and brought him down in full view of his own followers, leaving the imperial throne shattered and empty, and the long line of emperors ended there, in the dark, in a single decisive stroke. We will not dwell on the violence of it. It is enough to know that when the night was over, Darkwill was gone. The throne stood broken and vacant, and Noxus, for the first time in its history, had no emperor at all. The old accounts mark this moment plainly, and tell us that Swain seized control of Noxus some 7 years before the present age of the story. So it is recent, as the long history of an old empire goes, a thing within living memory, a change the older citizens still remember from before. Swain did not take the empty throne for himself, and that refusal was the heart of everything he built next. He had seen what a single ruler could become, how one mind, given absolute power, could doom a whole people through madness or corruption or simple incompetence, as Darkwill had nearly done. And so instead of crowning himself, he created a new way of ruling, and we will come to its shape gently in the next part of our story, Once we have rested a moment in the lives of the people who stood around him in that founding night, for now it is enough that the old order had ended, quietly and completely, and that a careful, watchful man stood in the ruins of it, declining to sit on the broken throne, already thinking of the far darkness he alone could partly see. In time, then, let us rest a little in the lives of the people who gathered around that empty throne, for the empire was never only its wars and its rulers. It was always also the particular men and women who carried its idea, and a few of them are worth knowing slowly. There were, first, two brothers from the eastern coast, and their story is the story Noxus most likes to tell about itself. Far to the east lay a port city called Basilich, which had been brought into the empire a little more than 20 years before the present age, when a captain named Cyrus and his army arrived, and the city submitted. In that city, two orphan boys grew up with nothing, the elder raising the younger by whatever harsh means the streets allowed. The elder was Darius, and the younger was Draven. When Cyrus came, the brothers were swept up into his war host, and there their paths slowly parted. Darius took to the army as if he had been made for it. He rose not by birth, for he had none worth naming, but by competence and discipline and an almost grim refusal to fail. There is a story, often told, of a battle on a place called Dalamore Plain, where a Noxian general lost his nerve and turned to flee, and Darius, a common soldier still, struck the coward down and rallied the routed army and turned the day. For that, he was given a command of his own, and from there he climbed steadily, year by year, until after a campaign against a strange enemy who fought from fortresses in the clouds. The old emperor named him Hand of Noxus, the same title Sion had once held, the leader of the empire's armies. To Noxus, Darius was living proof of its founding promise, that a man born with nothing in a conquered city could rise, on strength alone, to hold the highest command in the land. His path was not gentle. He spent long, hard years in a stalemate campaign in the cold steppes of the southern Freljord, far to the north, fighting an enemy that would not be beaten and would not break, and at one point he was captured and had to win his way back. And when at last he marched home, weary, to demand that the empire be set in order again, he found the old emperor already dead and Swain already risen. Darius might have resisted. Instead, he weighed the new man and the new order, and he gave it his loyalty, and he took his place as one of its three pillars, and he raised a new and elite order of soldiers to serve it. We will speak of that order soon. The younger brother, Draven, took a very different road. He too joined Cyrus's war host in his own way, which began with an attempt to assassinate the captain before circumstances turned him into a soldier instead. And yet army discipline bored him, for Draven was made for an audience, not an order of battle, and so he left the war host for the fighting pits, the arenas where condemned men and captured warriors fought for the crowds. These fighters were called Reckoners, and Draven became one, and for a time he flourished, and then he faded, until by the time Swain found him again, he was a washed-up and broke arena fighter past his best days. The coup gave Draven a second life. He joined Swain's cause, and afterward he became the Empire's executioner, putting condemned nobles to death in the arena before the watching crowds. And there, one day, Draven did the thing that remade him. A prisoner tried to flee across the sands, and Draven, from a high balcony, hurled an axe down and cut him from the fight in a single throw. The crowd loved it, and Draven, who understood crowds the way Darius understood battle, saw in their roar a whole new idea. He took the grim old Reckoner fights and turned them into spectacle, gave the fighters names and costumes and stories and rivalries, made of execution a show, and made himself its glorious center. The arenas, which had been mere punishment, became the most popular entertainment in the empire, and Draven became their brightest star, which was exactly where he had always wished to be. There was, in those same years, a colder and quieter figure, a woman raised from childhood to be a blade. Her name was Katarina, and she was the eldest child of a renowned noble house called du Couteau. Her father, Marcus, was a general and a master assassin, and from her earliest years, he trained her in his own dark craft, sending her to climb the city's towers in the dead of night, teaching her body to endure poisons a little at a time, shaping her into a weapon as deliberately as a smith shapes a blade. She had a younger sister, Cassiopeia, and an adopted brother, a former slum orphan named Talon, whom the general had taken into the house, and the three of them grew up in the shadow of that household and its hidden trade. Katarina's pride, in her youth, once cost the Empire a battle, when she abandoned her assigned mark to chase a greater kill, and her father, to discipline her, sent Talon against her, and in their clash, he left a scar across her left eye that she would carry always. And in time she grew into the Empire's most lethal assassin, and when the coup came, she made a hard choice. She sided with Swain over her own family. Later, when she learned that her father had only pretended to die and was in truth plotting against the new ruler, she was caught between blood and loyalty, and in the end, in a duel within a fortress, it was Swain himself who struck down her father to save her. Swain told her afterward that the whole long affair had been, in part, a test to see whether she could become an assassin capable of killing even him, should he ever turn into the kind of ruler the Empire needed killing. And he made her the head of the family's guild of assassins, and so the cold house of du Couteau passed quietly into a new generation. Her sister Cassiopeia, meanwhile, had gone seeking power of her own in the deep deserts of the south. And there a terrible thing happened to her, a transformation we will touch only lightly, for she was bitten by an ancient guardian in a forgotten tomb and changed into something half woman and half serpent. Her story, too, is sad, and we set it down gently and move on. There were others in that cold house worth a quiet word. There was the father, Marcus du Couteau, the general and master assassin who had shaped them all, a man of deep cunning who had supported Swain's rise and then turned against him in secret, going into hiding and plotting from the shadows, until the day his own daughter and his old master found him at last. There was the adopted son, Talon, who had begun as a nameless orphan in the slums, a knife in the dark with no family and no name, until the general cornered him one night and offered him a place in the house in exchange for his service. He took the name from the bladed cloak he wore, and he became one of the most dangerous killers in the Empire, loyal to the general above all, the brother who had scarred Katarina's eye in their youth, and whom Katarina, years later, would defeat and spare, marking his eye to match her own, so that the two of them carried matching scars from the two halves of the same long quarrel. And there was the mother, Soriana, the matriarch, politically brilliant and quiet, herself a senior figure of the Black Rose, who had reached the Cabal's long fingers down into the southern deserts of Shurima. It was she who had sent the younger daughter, Cassiopeia, into those deserts in the first place, seeking an old buried power on the errand that ended in the forgotten tomb and the serpent's bite. So even this one noble house held within it the whole shape of the Empire in miniature, the open service and the hidden treason, the loyalty and the scheming, the bright lethal children and the patient shadowed mother. all of it bound together under one old name, all of it tangled in the end, with the oldest shadow of all. The house of Ducouteau was only one of many old noble houses, of course, and the others had their own long, tangled histories, their own loyalties and treasons and quiet alliances with the Rose. They were the patrician families of Noxus Prime, the old blood of the capital, and for all the Empire's proud talk of strength raising anyone from anywhere, it was these old houses that still held much of the real power, generation after generation, marrying and feuding and maneuvering among themselves in the high, quiet rooms above the loud common city. Swain, when he took the throne, had worked to reduce their influence, to open the way a little wider for those who rose by merit rather than birth. And yet the old houses endured, as old houses do, their roots too deep in the Empire to pull out, and they remained, beneath the new order, a quiet, enduring power of their own, the patient aristocracy of a nation that liked to pretend it had none. There were others, too, who moved through these same years, and it is worth resting a moment in their stories, for they show the Empire from its many sides, and there is no hurry now to gather them all in. There was a young woman named Samira, born far to the south, in the deserts of Shurima. Her home city was a place called Amakra, and on her 14th birthday it was destroyed, swept away by the followers of an old desert power, and her family fled north to the coastal city of Belgium, which by then had joined the Empire. There Samira grew up between two worlds, the desert she had lost and the Empire that had taken her in, and she enlisted as a soldier under a captain named Indari. And she made herself into a fighter of black powder pistols and a single bright blade, fearless to the point of recklessness, drawn always toward the loudest and most dangerous corner of any fight. She lost an eye, in later years, in a hard uprising in the southern hills, and she went on fighting all the same. What she did not know for a long while was that her captain was quietly an agent of the Black Rose, so that even her plain soldier's life had the old shadow folded into it, as so many lives in Noxus secretly did. There was a yordle named Cled, a small and cantankerous creature out of the Empire's oldest folk legends, whose tale stretched all the way back to the founding. The stories said that Cled had fought in every campaign the war hosts had ever waged, that he had been there at the taking of one city after another, at sieges with old hard names, riding into every war the Empire had ever made, furious and unkillable, and never once content. Whether all of that was true, no one could say, for legends grow in the telling, and Cled's had been growing for centuries. He was the kind of figure an old empire collects, half history and half tall tale, a small, angry thread of continuity running back through all the wars to the very beginning. And the soldiers told stories of him on quiet nights the way soldiers everywhere tell the old stories. Far to the east, in the conquered provinces of Ionia, there was a fighter named Set, who was half of the deer folk of that land and half Noxian by his father, a pit fighter who had come to Ionia with the occupation and then deserted his family for richer arenas elsewhere. Set grew up poor and half belonging, looked down upon by both his mother's people and his father's, and he made his way up through the Noxian-run fighting pits of occupied Ionia by sheer strength until he ruled them, and then ruled a whole shadow world of the arenas in the wake of the war. He owed his rise, in a hard way, to the Noxian presence in his homeland, and he loathed that presence all the same, a man built by an empire he despised. His was an Ionian story more than a Noxian one in the end, but it grew in the soil the empire had turned, and so it belongs a little to this telling too. There were the fighters of the arenas who had come to Noxus in chains, and made something of themselves there. There was a great horned minotaur, a clan leader taken in the southern campaigns, the last living soul of his people, who fought in the pits and endured when all his kin were gone. There was an eastern sailor, captured at sea, who fought under a borrowed arena name and became a famous champion of the sands before, in time, winning his way free. The arenas were full of such lives, hard and bright and brief, foreign-born men and women who had been brought to the capital as captives and had carved out fame and sometimes freedom with nothing but their hands. The empire prized them while they won and forgot them when they fell, and the sand was raked smooth after each of them, ready for the next. And there was the slum-born gatherer of the dead, the one who would in time be called Carthus, whose story is one of the gentlest in all the empire, for all that it is a story of death. He was born among the poor beyond the walls, in the crowded streets where the tallymen made their daily rounds, and as a young man he joined that old order devoted to the spirit kindred, the order that gathered the dead and built their pyres. He began, as all of them did, as a humble grave digger. In time he rose to build the pyres themselves, and then to walk the streets as a corpse collector with an iron-wheeled cart, gathering the fallen and notching his staff for each one. And in that quiet work, he found something that he loved, a beauty in the laments sung over the gathered dead, a peace in the patient tending of those the city had finished with. We will return to his streets near the end of the night, when we walk softly through the capital in the dark, for his is the part of Noxus that lies closest to sleep. Behind all of these figures, behind the brothers and the assassins and even behind Swain himself, the old shadow still moved. LeBlanc, the sorceress of illusions who had helped unmake the Iron Revenant at the very dawn of the Empire, was still there, still leading the secret society called the Black Rose after more than 1,000 years. She had reshaped herself again and again across the centuries, wearing name after name, face after face, until no one could say what she had first been. It was she who had whispered the old emperor toward ruin, she who had faked her own death when Swain's purge came too close, she who endured while emperors rose and fell like seasons, and with her, the ancient blood mage Vladimir, who had once been a hostage prince in some forgotten age, and had learned the magic of flesh from a master he eventually destroyed. Vladimir's own mind could not hold the weight of his long memory, and so he kept written chronicles of his own life instead. And he surfaced in the world when the times were interesting and withdrew when they were dull, a flamboyant and ageless figure moving through the high society of the capital with the patience of someone who had already outlived everything. These two, and the cabal they had founded, were the quiet history of Noxus, the thread that ran unbroken beneath all the loud one, and their deepest purpose, the thing that justified all their long scheming, was the same fear that troubled Swain's borrowed sight, the fear of the Iron Revenant's return from that distant realm where his soul lay gathering. So the oldest danger and the oldest watchers were bound together, and had been since the founding. Two halves of a single very old worry, kept hidden beneath the wars and the arenas and the rising and falling of ordinary rulers. In time, the story turns away from particular lives and toward the shape of the thing they all served, the structure of the empire itself, which is calmer ground and good ground for the middle of a long night. We left Swain standing in the ruins of the old order, declining the empty throne. What he built in its place was a council, and the council was called the Trifarix, which means simply the Council of Three. Rather than one ruler, Noxus would now be governed by three, and each of the three would embody one of what the Empire called the principles of strength. The first principle was vision, the seeing of what must be done and where the Empire must go. The second was might, the raw power to do it. The third was guile, the cleverness and cunning that work where force cannot. The three sat together at a marble table set at the foot of the now empty imperial throne, a quiet reminder that no one would sit upon that throne again. Swain himself took the seat of vision, for he above all others saw the long shape of things and the far darkness coming. The seat of might went to Darius, the hand of Noxus, whose strength had carried him from a conquered orphan to the highest command, and who now anchored the council with the plain force of arms. The third seat, the seat of guile, was taken by a figure who kept no public name, who was known only as the Faceless, and whose true identity was never revealed. Some have wondered about that figure across the years, but the Empire never said, and we will not guess. It is enough that the council had three, and that three was the point. Swain's reasoning was simple, and it grew directly out of everything Noxus had just suffered. A single ruler, he had seen, could doom the whole nation through madness or corruption or weakness, as the old emperor very nearly had. And yet a council of three would always, if one member faltered or turned, have two others to hold that one accountable. It was a structure built from hard experience, meant to keep any single failing mind from ever again dragging the whole empire down with it. And so the long age of emperors gave way to the quieter age of the three, and the broken throne was left to stand empty as its own kind of monument. There is more to say, slowly, about the three principles of strength on which the whole council rested, for they were the deep idea beneath the modern empire, and turning them over gently is calm work for the middle of the night. The first principle was vision, the seeing of what must be done and where the empire must go, the long sight that looks past the present moment toward the distant shape of things. It was the principle Swain himself embodied, the watcher with the borrowed sight, the one who saw further than anyone around him and steered by what he saw. Vision without the others would be only dreaming, a seeing that could not act. And yet set beside the other two, it gave the council its direction, its sense of the long road ahead. The second principle was might, the raw strength to do what vision saw must be done, the plain power of arms and will. It was the principle Darius embodied, the soldier who had risen from nothing to the highest command by sheer competence and force. Might without the others would be only brutality, a strength with no direction and no cunning. And yet set beside vision and guile, it gave the council its force, its ability to make real in the hard world what the others only saw or schemed. The third principle was guile, the cleverness that works where force cannot, the cunning and the subtlety and the patient indirect way. It was the principle the Faceless embodied, the unnamed third whose very anonymity was itself a kind of guile. Guile without the others would be only scheming, a cleverness with no power behind it and no honest aim. And yet set beside vision and might, it gave the council its reach into the places that strength could not go. And the deep wisdom of it, the thing Swain had understood, was that no one of the three was enough alone, that each needed the others to be made whole and kept honest. Vision and might and guile, the seeing and the doing and the cunning, balanced against one another at the marble table, each holding the others in check, so that no single appetite could run away with the whole. It was a careful idea, born from the hard lesson of the old emperor's ruin, and whether it would hold across the long centuries, no one could yet say. And yet it was, at least, an attempt to build wisdom into the very shape of the state, to make the structure itself proof against the madness of any one mind. And there is something quietly hopeful in that. In a war-born nation trying, after all its hard history, to govern itself with a little balance and a little restraint. Beneath the three, the empire ran on a great machinery of lesser offices, and there is something settling in the plain accounting of it. The conquered cities and territories were each governed by a steward who enforced the empire's law, gathered its taxes, and oversaw the raising of new soldiers from the local people. The stewards held the far provinces together, each in their own city, each answering upward to the capital. There were stewards across the whole sprawl of the empire, in the eastern ports and the western farmlands and the mineral hills of the south, ordinary administrators of an extraordinary reach, and the empire often said of itself, in its quieter administrative moods, that the lifeblood of the empire is its bureaucracy, which is perhaps the least warlike thing a war-born nation ever believed about itself, and is true all the same. The armies of Noxus, to an outside eye, looked like chaos. They were not built as one uniform host marching in step. Instead, they were a great gathering of semi-independent warbands, each fighting in its own style, and these warbands together composed the larger war hosts. This looseness was deliberate, and it concealed a real and careful discipline. The empire had learned, over its long centuries of conquest, that a conquered people brought their own strengths to the table, their own ways of fighting, their own weapons and traditions, and that it was foolish to grind all of that down into sameness. So conquered peoples who swore loyalty to Noxus became part of its armies and added their unique strengths to the empire's war efforts, and the war hosts grew richer and stranger and more capable with every land they took. A single Noxian army might hold within it the heavy infantry of the homeland, the horsemen of one conquered plain, the archers of another, the strange war creatures of a third, all bound loosely together under one banner, each doing what it did best. After the coup, Darius raised from these armies a new and elite order, the most loyal and most prestigious soldiers in all of Noxus, and he called them the Trifarian Legion. Their members were chosen personally, handpicked for their loyalty and their skill, and they wore dark steel armor marked with 3 notches, one for each of the principles of strength they served. Even within this proud order, the empire did not force uniformity, for the old wisdom held, and each legionnaire kept something of their own way. The Trifarian Legion became the iron core of the modern Noxian military. The soldiers one would find lining the great stairways of the capital, standing in their dark plate in the torchlight. The visible strength of the new order. There was another branch of the military, quieter and stranger, called the Warmasons. They were scouts and engineers and builders all at once. The ones who designed and oversaw the roads and bridges and fortifications that held the empire together. And yet, they had a second function as well, for they often went ahead of the armies, slipping into a land that Noxus meant to take, mapping its roads and its weaknesses, learning where an invasion might best fall. Some of them lived for years inside the cities they were quietly studying, ordinary seeming people who were in truth the empire's patient eyes. They built the empire's bones, and they scouted its next meal, and they did both with the same unhurried care. And when the empire did take a new land, it followed a pattern so well worn that it had become almost a ritual, and there is a strange calm in how regular it was. First, the Warmasons would scout and map. Then a war host would come and subdue the people. The leaders who had ruled before would be killed, or recruited into the empire's service, or simply replaced by a steward sent from the capital. And then, upon the main road into the conquered territory, the empire would raise a great arch of dark stone, quarried from the mountains around the capital. And this arch was called a Noxus, a word from the old Ur-Nox tongue meaning gateway to Noxus. Every traveler entering or leaving the territory would pass beneath it and be left in no doubt who now held the land. And over the years that followed, the conquered people would slowly be absorbed, for the empire held that the children of foreign lands taken into the empire became Noxian by birth, so that within a generation or two, the line between conqueror and conquered would blur, and the territory would simply be Noxus, as if it always had been. There were other offices too, smaller and older and stranger, and they round out the picture of how the empire ran. There were the headsmen, sanctioned public executioners, who held the right to put to death any citizen they judged to be corrupt. There were the reckoners of the arenas, the fighters Draven had turned into stars. And there was an old guild devoted to the gathering of the dead, the tallymen of the spirit called kindred, who walked the poorer streets of the capital and collected the bodies of those who had died and built the pyres that burned them. A new member of that order began as a humble gravedigger, then rose to become a builder of pyres, and at last a corpse collector who walked the streets with an iron-wheeled cart, notching a staff once for each soul gathered. It is grim work, told plainly, and yet there is something almost gentle in its patience, in the slow daily rounds of those who tended the empire's dead, and one of them, a man who would later be called Karthus, came to love the quiet laments he sang over that work so much that he gave his whole self to it. We will pass his streets again later, near the end, when we walk softly through the capital at night. There is more to say, slowly, about how the empire actually held itself together, for the machinery of it was vast and patient and mostly unglamorous, and patient, unglamorous things are good company for the deep middle of a night. Think again of the Warmasons, those scouts and engineers and builders who went ahead of the armies. Their work began long before any battle, sometimes years before. A Warmason might enter a city the empire had not yet decided to take, and simply live there, as a trader or a craftsman or a traveler, learning its streets and its moods, noting where its walls were weak and where its food came from and how its people felt about their rulers. Some of them embedded themselves so deeply into the places they studied that they rose into the upper circles of foreign cities, trusted and welcomed, all the while quietly drawing the maps that would one day guide an invasion. And then there was the building, the other half of their craft, the roads laid straight across conquered country, the bridges thrown over rivers, the fortifications raised at every strategic point. The empire moved on its roads, and the Warmasons made the roads. And so in a real sense, the Warmasons made the empire's reach possible, patiently, a mile of good road at a time. Think of the long, slow work of integration, the way a conquered land became, over years and generations, simply Noxus. After the war host had passed, and the steward had been installed, and the dark arch raised at the road's mouth, the real change came slowly, almost invisibly, in the ordinary business of living. The children of the conquered grew up under Noxian law, speaking of Noxus as their own, and the empire held that such children were Noxian by birth, fully and without question. A generation passed, and then another, and the memory of having been something else faded into old stories the grandparents told, and the province that had once been taken by force became, without anyone marking the day, simply another part of the whole. There was friction in it, of course, and resentment that lingered in some places for a very long time, and yet the slow tide of it ran mostly one way, and the empire grew not only by conquering, but by this patient absorbing, this quiet turning of strangers into citizens over the long, unhurried passage of years. Think, too, of the strange old institution of the headsman, the sanctioned executioners who walked the empire with the right to put to death any citizen they judged corrupt. It was a harsh power, and we will not dwell on its harshness. But there was a logic to it that fit the empire's hard idea of itself, that corruption was a rot to be cut out wherever it was found, by anyone with the authority and the will. They moved through the cities as a kind of grim conscience, feared and respected, and most citizens went their whole lives without ever crossing one, and were content to keep it that way. And think of the reckoners and their arenas, which had become, in the modern age, the great common entertainment of the people. There were many kinds of arena fighting, from the simple matches between paired fighters to the grand spectacles Draven had invented, with their costumes and their personas and their long-running rivalries. There was a harsher variant, too, the most punishing of them all, in which a single fighter faced opponent after opponent, each fresh, until at last the fighter fell. And we set that down plainly and pass it by, for it is not where the night is going. What matters, for our slow purposes, is the place the arenas held in the life of the city, the way the people gathered under the torches on an evening to watch and roar and forget their own hard days, the way the great fighters became known and loved and argued over in the taverns afterward, the way an evening at the arena was, for an ordinary Noxian, a bright, loud island in a hard week. It was cruelty made into festival, which is an old human trick, older than Noxus, and the Empire did it on a grand scale and thought little of it. Behind all of this, beneath the stewards and the warmisons and the headsmen and the arenas, the old shadow kept its own patient work. The Black Rose moved through the Empire's high places the way water moves through stone, slowly and without sound, finding every crack. Its members wore masks at their private gatherings, in candlelit halls where the great and the secret met under assumed faces, and the society's mark, a single dark rose, was etched quietly into shadowed archways here and there across the Empire, a sign that meant nothing to most who passed it, and everything to the few who knew. For more than 1,000 years, the rose had guided noble houses toward marriages and feuds that served its ends, had placed its people beside emperors and generals, had nudged the whole slow course of the empire this way and that, all toward purposes it kept entirely to itself. Most Noxians lived their entire lives never knowing it existed, never suspecting that beneath the loud, visible empire of war hosts and arenas there ran a second, quieter empire of whispers and masks, older than the throne itself, patient as stone, watching always for the one thing it truly feared. And what it feared, as we have said, was the return of the Iron Revenant. That was the thread that tied the oldest shadow to the oldest danger. The reason the Black Rose had been founded in the first place, in the founding days, by the two who had helped seal him away. They knew, as almost no one else did, that he was not gone but only withdrawn, resting in his far realm, gathering himself across the centuries. And so they watched, generation upon generation, for any sign that the long stillness might be ending, any tremor of the old, dark waking. It was a strange purpose for a cabal of schemers, this long vigil against a sleeping thing, and over the centuries it had become tangled up with simple appetite for power, until it was hard to say how much the rose still served its founding fear and how much it simply served itself. And yet the fear was real, at the bottom of it, and it had kept its long watch through every rise and fall of the visible empire, waiting for a waking that had not yet come. In time, the story drifts outward from the capital. Across the wide and patchwork lands the empire had gathered to itself over its long centuries, and these far provinces are quiet ground, good for the settling middle of the night. The empire was never a single, even thing. It was a great quilt of conquered places, each sewn in at a different time and in a different way, each keeping a little of what it had been before Noxus came. And the manner of their joining ranged across the whole span, from violence to something almost like welcome. Far to the east lay the coastal ports, the old salt and trade cities of the eastern shore. There was Basilich, the city of the two brothers, brought into the empire a little more than 20 years before the present age, when Captain Cyrus and his army arrived, and the city gave way. And there was another eastern city, Drakengate, which the old accounts remember as the last settlement to fall before Noxus declared itself an empire. A city taken in an old campaign so long ago that it sits at the very hinge between the time before Noxus was an empire and the time after. These eastern ports gave the empire its windows onto the sea, and their salt air and their harbors became, over the years, simply another part of the whole. To the west lay the farming country, the poor hill hamlets clinging to rocky ground, and among them Travail, where Riven had been born and raised before the war took her east. This was hard, plain country of stony fields and small holdings, and it had been folded into the empire long before, its quiet farms now feeding the war hosts that passed through. Scattered through the western and southern frontiers were other small holdings with names like Kilgrove and Glorft and Falgren, coastal and inland both, each with its own steward, each taken in some old campaign and then left to settle into the long, ordinary life of a province. In the foothills of the northern Iron Spike Mountains stood a place called Delverhold, and its story is one of the calmer kinds of conquest. Delverhold had once been an independent kingdom of its own, rich in gold and iron, a cold fortress realm against the mountains. Roughly a century before the present age, it had been absorbed into the empire, and its mines now fed the empire's endless forges with the dark steel that made Noxian armor. It is a place of cold stone and cold iron and the deep, patient work of mining, far from the loud arenas of the capital, and there is a stillness to it, the stillness of deep tunnels and slow ore and a fortress that has long since stopped being a kingdom and become simply a part of something larger. To the south spread mineral-rich plains, the Rockrund country, hills full of ore and the makings of black powder. This had been an uneasy province, prone to unrest, and it was the ancestral home of one of the empire's noble houses, the Medarda line, who would in time produce a warlord whose story reached far beyond Noxus. And yet across most of its years, Rockrund was simply what it was, a stretch of mineral country worked for what it could give, its hills slowly stripped of their wealth to feed the empire's hunger for metal and powder. And to the far south, across the desert sands of a land called Shurima, the empire reached in a different way entirely, and this is perhaps the gentlest of all its conquests, and worth resting in. The northern Shuriman coast held old cities, among them Beljun and Urzaris, and these places did not fall to fire and war host so much as drift, slowly and largely peacefully, into the empire's keeping. They were trading cities, salt cities, places where Noxian and Shuriman ways could meet without one wholly erasing the other. The General Swain, in his younger years before his wound, had made much of his early reputation in the Shuriman desert, raising the dark arches of the Noxtora across the sands, extending the empire's reach into that distant heat. And what grew up afterward in those coastal cities was a coexistence more than a conquest. Two old cultures living side by side. The Noxian quarter and the Shuriman quarter sharing the same streets, the same harbors, the same long warm evenings by the water. In the capital itself, far to the north, there grew a small piece of that distant south, a quarter where Shuriman folk who had come into the empire made their home. It was called the Zagaya Enclave, and it was a place of tented pavilions pitched near the water, where the people kept the songs and customs of the desert they had left behind. On still nights, the old desert marching songs would drift from those tented pavilions across the water, a sound from 1,000 miles away carried on the night air of a northern city, and it was, by all accounts, a beautiful and a peaceful thing to hear. One warm thread of elsewhere woven into the hard fabric of the capital. The empire did not absorb every land smoothly, of course, and it is honest to say so quietly. There were provinces that chafed under their stewards, and there were rebellions, some of them recent. In the eastern port of Basilich, there was an uprising, years after its conquest, when its own steward turned against the empire over the atrocities of the chemical war in Ionia, and the brothers Darius and Draven were sent to bring the city back to order, which they did, though the cost of it fell hard on the family that had raised the rebellion. In the southern Rockrun country, there was a secessionist rising, when the people of the Mineral Hills used their own black powder against the war hosts sent to subdue them. And in the conquered provinces of Ionia, far to the east, the empire's hold was always uneasy, for the Ionians never fully accepted the arches and the stewards, and rebel groups lingered in the hills and the ruins. We touch these unrests lightly, and we do not linger in their fighting, for they are part of the empire's restless edge, and the restless edge is not where we are going tonight. We are drifting, slowly, toward the center and the calm. Let us linger a little longer among the provinces, slowly, for each of them has its own quiet texture, and there is no hurry to move on. Consider the eastern coast again, the old salt and trade ports, and the long, ordinary life of a city like Basilich after the conquest had faded into memory. The harbor would have filled each morning with the boats of fishermen who had fished those waters before Noxus came and went on fishing them after. The catch hauled up onto the same old stones, sold in the same old market, under a new banner that most of the fishers troubled themselves about very little. The salt wind came in off the eastern sea, and the gulls cried over the rooftops, and the children of the port grew up knowing the smell of fish and tar and the sound of the tide, and to them the empire was simply the order of things, the law and the tax and the occasional war host passing through, no stranger than the weather. This was what conquest became in the end, in most places, not the drama of the taking, but the long, quiet ordinariness of the having, generation after generation of small lives lived out under a flag that had once arrived as an enemy and had become, with time, merely home. Consider the western farming country, the hill hamlets like Travail, where the fields clung to stony slopes. This was the country Riven had come from before the war took her, and it was hard plain country, of small holdings and long labor and the old slow rhythms that farming has always kept. The planting and the tending and the harvest, the seasons turning over the same fields year upon year. The people there were tough and weathered and not given to much talk, and they lived close to the land and far from the loud heart of the empire. And an arena or a black rose mask or an emperor's coup might as well have been happening on the moon, for all it touched the daily round of the hill farms. The wind moved over the stony fields, and the smoke rose from the small stone houses in the evening, and the work was never quite done, and the years went by, and that was the whole of it. For most of them, a quiet, hard life on quiet, hard land at the empire's western edge. Consider Delverhold in the north, against the foothills of the Iron Spike Mountains, the old fortress kingdom that had become a mine. There the cold came down off the mountains, and the deep tunnels ran far into the rock. And the work was the patient, dangerous work of pulling iron and gold up out of the dark. The dark steel that armored half the empire began here, in these deep, cold shafts, hewn out a little at a time by miners who would never see the armor it became. There is a particular stillness to a mining country, a stillness of stone and depth and slow, patient labor underground, of long days in the dark and short, cold days above, and Delverhold had it in full. A place of iron and quiet, and the deep, unhurried work of taking metal from the mountain's heart. Consider the southern plains of Rockrund, the mineral country, wide and open under a big sky, its hills full of ore and the makings of black powder. It was the home country of an old noble house, the Medarda line, and from it would come, in time, a warlord whose story ranged far beyond Noxus, all the way to a distant city of invention and back again. And yet across most of its long history, Rockrund was simply mineral country, worked hard for what it could give. Its hills slowly stripped and its powder slowly hauled away to the Empire's wars. A stretch of open land under wide weather where the wind never quite stopped and the horizon ran out flat in every direction. And consider, longest and gentlest of all, the far south, the desert reaches of Shurima and the coastal cities the Empire had gathered there without much fire. Beljoun and Erzeris were old places, older in some ways than Noxus itself, trading cities on the warm northern edge of a vast desert, and when they came into the Empire, they came mostly by agreement and slow drift, rather than by storm. What grew there afterward was a true mingling, two old peoples sharing the same streets and harbors, the severe dark stone of Noxus standing beside the warm pale stone of Shurima, the red and black banners flying over markets that still sold the spices and cloth of the desert trade. In the evenings the heat would lift a little off the water, and the call of the harbor would mix with the older calls of the desert, and the two ways of living, the conquerors and the conquereds, would settle side by side into the long, warm southern night. There were tensions beneath it, of course, and some who never accepted the arches and the stewards, and we touched that lightly and let it lie. And yet the texture of those cities, day to day, was a slow and largely peaceful coexistence, the gentlest face the Empire ever showed. Two cultures learning across the years to share a home by the warm southern sea. These were the provinces then, the wide patchwork of the Empire's far places, each with its own weather and its own work and its own slow, ordinary life. The eastern salt ports and the western hill farms, the cold northern mines and the open southern plains and the warm desert harbors, all of them held loosely together by the roads and the arches and the stewards, all of them slowly becoming, over the long, unhurried years, simply Noxus. For all its conquests, the Empire's deepest belief about itself remained the one it had carried since the founding. That strength was the only true currency, and that anyone who had it could rise. This was the official faith, the proud story Noxus told about itself, that a person of any birth, from any land, of any wealth or none, could climb to power and respect if only they had the necessary strength of will and skill. And it was, in part, true. Darius had lived it, rising from a conquered orphan to the hand of Noxus. Riven had lived it for a time. The arenas were full of foreign-born fighters who had won fame and freedom with their hands. The Empire actively prized those with magical gifts and sought them out and raised them up wherever they were found. And yet, beneath the proud story, the older shapes of power endured, quietly, as they tend to. The old noble houses still held outsized influence. The Black Rose still schemed in the shadows behind the throne. The conquered provinces still chafed under stewards sent from elsewhere. And beneath the walls of the capital, in the sprawling slums, there were still the poor and the forgotten, for whom the promise of rising through strength was, most days, a long way off. The Empire, in its honest moments, knew this about itself. Its own watchers understood that the greatest danger to Noxus came not from its enemies beyond the borders, but from within, from the old houses and the hidden cabal, and the slow frictions of holding so many peoples under one hard banner. It was a nation forever a little at war with itself, even in its times of peace, and it had made an uneasy sort of balance of that, the way a long married couple makes peace with old disagreements, and went on. In time, the story turns inward again and downward, toward the capital itself, and toward the slow texture of its nights, where we will rest for a good long while now, simply looking at the city as it is, with no event to follow and nothing left to decide. The capital of Noxus was built around the immortal bastion, the ancient fortress the Iron Revenant had raised, and the whole city had grown up over the long centuries in its dark shadow. It was a city of coal fire and iron, and its air carried always the scent of industry, for in Noxus the forges rarely cooled. Day and night, year upon year, the great forges burned, working the dark steel of the mountains into armor and weapons, and the smoke and the warmth of them settled over the city like a constant low breath. On most nights the weather was hot and dry, and the wind that moved through the streets carried that smell of coal fire, and from the eastern edges a faint trace of the sea. The streets of the capital were narrow and twisting, and they had been made that way on purpose long ago, to choke and frustrate any army that might break in. They wound and turned and doubled back, and above them the rooftops were flat and crenellated, so that defenders could stand upon them and command anyone below. It was a city built for war even in its quietest corners, austere and severe in its shapes, all sharp, simple lines and gray and red and black, function set always before beauty, dark steel showing everywhere in its fittings and its gates. And yet a city is a city, and people lived their whole lives in those twisting streets, and over the centuries the hard bones of the place had taken on the soft accumulation of ordinary living, the smells of cooking and the sounds of voices and the small warm lights of windows. The official short accounts of the city say that the nights in Noxus were never silent, and they were not, for so many thousands of people from across the whole empire had been gathered into one place that quiet was simply not possible. And yet the sounds of a Noxian night were not the sounds of alarm. They were the layered, settled noise of a great city breathing in the dark. From the Zagaya enclave by the water came the desert marching songs drifting from the tented pavilions, soft and strange and far from home. From a nearby arena came the faint martial clash of blades, the reckoners at their practice or their late matches, a distant rhythm of metal. From an iron-walled enclosure somewhere came the low howling of the great drakehounds, catching on the wind the scent of the kill yards to the north. And under it all ran the human chorus of any large city after dark, the cries of grief and the roars of drunken soldiers and the calls of the street hawkers who did their best trade in the hours when the day was done. It was not a peaceful sound, exactly, and yet there was something steady in it, something that asked nothing. The sound of a city simply being itself in the dark, the way the sea is simply itself, whether anyone listens or not. Within the great bastion at the city's heart, there were grand and solemn spaces, and we can walk through them slowly, for they are still and cool, and there is no hurry. There was a long stairway called the Stairs of Triumph, and it climbed upward toward the seat of power, and every 12 steps along its length there stood a legionnaire of the Trifarian Legion in dark steel plate, motionless, lining the ascent in silent ranks. To climb those stairs was to pass between two unmoving columns of armored figures, still as statues in the torchlight, the steel catching the low flame, the only sound one's own footsteps on the old stone. At the top lay the audience chamber, a cavernous throne room so vast that it could hold 1,000 petitioners at once, a great cold hall of dark stone, and at the foot of its empty throne sat the marble table of the three. The throne itself stood vacant, as it had since the night of the coup, broken and unsitting, a monument to the idea that no single ruler would ever again hold the whole of Noxus in one pair of hands. There is a particular stillness to a great empty hall at night, a vastness that swallows sound, and the audience chamber had that stillness in full, 1,000 petitioners' worth of empty space, dim and quiet and waiting for a morning that was still hours away. Elsewhere in the city stood the Shrine of the Wolf, and it was one of the stranger and quieter monuments of the capital. The people of Noxus honored a spirit called Kindred, which had two halves, a lamb and a wolf, and of the two it was the wolf, the wilder and more violent half, that Noxus loved best. The shrine raised to the wolf was an open-sided tower of many tiers, each level held up by 3 great pillars, and within it sat an enormous statue of a wolf, 50 feet of carved black obsidian, seated and watchful in the open air. The wind moved freely through the open sides of that tower, and the great dark wolf sat in it through every weather, by day and by night, looking out over the city with its still stone eyes, neither hunting nor resting, simply seated there, as it had been for a very long time, and would be for a very long time more. And then there was the Mortora quarter, the strangest quiet of all the city's quiets, and a good place to slow down and grow drowsy. Mortora was the wealthiest district of the capital, and its name meant the Iron Gate. And unlike the cramped and twisting streets of the rest of the city, its avenues were luxurious and comfortably spacious, broad and well-built, the homes of those who had risen highest in the empire. And yet Mortora had a peculiar reputation, for at night it was the most ominous district in all of Noxus, and the reason was simple and strange. Its streets were never lit. No torch, no lantern, no lamp ever burned along those wide and wealthy avenues after dark. The district simply went black when the sun went down, its grand houses standing in complete unlit silence, its broad streets pooling with shadow, and the wealthy folk who lived there kept to whatever private lights burned behind their walls and left the streets to the dark. It was in the Mortora quarter that the ancient Vladimir kept one of his houses, the blood mage who had outlived 1,000 years and more, the flamboyant and ageless aristocrat who surfaced when the times were interesting and withdrew when they were dull. One imagines him there in the lampless dark, in a grand house on an unlit street, keeping his written chronicles of a life too long to remember, surrounded by the comfortable silence of a district that had decided, for reasons of its own, to do without light. There is something almost peaceful in the picture, for all its strangeness, the dark, quiet streets, the old houses, the patient ancient man writing down his memories so as not to lose them, the whole wealthy quarter sleeping under no lights at all. Let us walk a little more slowly through the capital at night, for there is no better place to grow drowsy than these old streets in the dark, and there is no hurry at all. Come back to the twisting streets of the city itself, away from the wealthy, lampless quarter, into the ordinary lanes where most of the people lived. They were narrow, these streets, and they turned and doubled and ran into one another at odd angles, for they had been laid out long ago to baffle any attacking army, and what had been built for war had become, over the centuries, simply the maze that everyone lived in. By day they were crowded and loud, full of carts and hawkers and the business of a great city, and yet late at night they emptied and quieted, lit here and there by a torch in a bracket or a candle behind a shutter. And a person walking them in the small hours would pass through long pools of shadow and brief warm islands of light, hearing only their own footsteps on the worn stone and, now and then, a voice behind a wall, a snatch of song from a late tavern, the soft sounds of a city mostly gone to sleep. The flat, crenellated rooftops stood black against the night sky above, and the smell of the cool day still hung in the air, coal smoke and stone and the faint distant salt of the sea, and the great maze of the capital lay quiet around the walker, turning and turning in on itself, holding its thousands of sleepers in its old stone arms. Come back to the great forges, which never stopped. Even in the deepest part of the night, when the rest of the city slept, the forge fires burned, for the Empire's hunger for iron never rested, and so neither did the smiths. From certain quarters of the city one could see the glow of them against the underside of the night, a low red light pulsing softly where the great furnaces worked, and here, very faintly, the distant rhythm of the hammers, a slow, far heartbeat of metal that went on all night, every night, year upon year. There was something almost soothing in it, that constant, distant working, the way the sound of rain on a roof is soothing, a steady, unhurried rhythm that asked nothing and simply went on. The deep, slow pulse of the city's endless labor carrying softly through the dark. Come back to the stairs of triumph, climbing up toward the seat of power, and to the legionnaires who stood along them through the night. Every 12 steps one of them stood, in dark steel plate, motionless, the torchlight catching softly on the metal. And at night, when no petitioners climbed and no business was done, they simply stood there in the long, quiet, rank upon rank of still armored figures lining the empty stairway in the flickering light. A watch is a strange and patient thing, hour upon hour of simply standing, simply being present, while the city sleeps and nothing happens, and the torches burn slowly down. The legionnaires kept that watch through every night, still as the statues they resembled, and the great stairway rose between them into the dark, silent and guarded, and waiting for a morning still hours away. Come back to the vast audience chamber at the top, the throne room large enough for 1,000 petitioners, and to the deep stillness that filled it at night. By day it might hold a great press of people come to seek judgment or favor, their voices rising into the high, dark vault above. And yet at night it stood empty, a cavern of shadow and cold stone, the marble table of the three standing quiet at the foot of the broken throne, the whole great space holding nothing but its own silence. There is a particular quality to the stillness of a very large empty room in the dark, a vastness that seems to absorb the smallest sound, and the audience chamber had that stillness at its deepest in the hours before dawn. 1,000 petitioners' worth of empty space, dim and cool and utterly quiet. The empty throne keeping its long vigil over the dark. Come back to the shrine of the wolf, the open-sided tower with the great obsidian statue seated within it. At night the wind moved freely through the open sides of that tower, and the 50-foot wolf of black stone sat in the moving air as it always sat, looking out over the sleeping city with its still blind eyes. There were no walls to keep the night out, and so the dark and the wind came and went around the great seated figure freely, and it minded neither, for it was stone, and stone keeps its own long patience. Through every night of every year the wolf sat there, in the open air, watching nothing, guarding nothing, simply present, a vast, still shape in the dark at the heart of a city that loved it, keeping the kind of watch that only stone can keep, the watch that outlasts every watcher. And come back once more to the Zagaya enclave by the water, the quarter of the desert folk with their tented pavilions. On still nights, the old marching songs of the desert drifted out across the water from those tents, soft and strange and far from the land that had made them, carried on the warm night air of a northern city 1,000 miles from the sands. They were songs the people had brought with them when they came into the empire, and they had kept them. And on quiet nights, they sang them still, by the water under the northern stars, and the sound carried out over the sleeping city, one warm thread of elsewhere woven through the dark. A person lying awake in the capital on such a night might hear them very faintly, those desert songs from the tents by the water, and not know the words, and be soothed by them all the same, the way one is soothed by any gentle distant sound in the night that means other people are near and at peace and singing themselves softly towards sleep. These were the nights of Noxus then, layered and old and never quite silent, the maze of streets gone quiet under the black rooftops, the forge glow pulsing softly against the dark, the legionnaires standing their patient watch on the great stairway, the empty throne room holding its vast stillness, the stone wolf seated in the moving air, the desert songs drifting by the water. It was a hard city, built for war, severe in all its shapes, and yet at night, in the deep hours, it softened into something almost gentle. A great old place breathing slowly in the dark, holding its thousands of sleepers, keeping its quiet watches, waiting without impatience for the slow coming of another day. Beyond the walls of the capital, out past the battle-scarred old fortifications, lay the slums, and even here, in the poorest part of the empire, there is a quiet to be found, if one looks at it gently. The slums were a hard place, crowded and poor, where sickness came often and death was a familiar thing. There were almshouses, and there were the small fires of the poor, and there were the pyres that burned at the city's edges, sending their slow smoke up into the night. It was not a comfortable place to live, and it would be untrue to pretend otherwise. And yet within it, people lived their whole lives, and loved one another, and went about their days, the way people do everywhere, in every condition. Through those streets each day moved the tallymen of kindred, the gatherers of the dead we spoke of before. They walked the poor quarters with their iron-wheeled carts, slow and patient, collecting the bodies of those who had died in the night. And for each soul they gathered, they cut a single notch into their staffs, keeping a quiet tally of the dead they tended. There was a rhythm to their rounds, a daily slowness, the soft iron creak of the cartwheels on the stones, the gentle ritual of the notch. And among the men who walked those rounds in his younger years was the one who would become Carthus, who found in that work and in the laments he sang over it something he came to love, a beauty in the quiet tending of the dead that most would never see. He would sing softly as he walked, an old lament for the gathered souls, and the sound of it moved through the slum streets in the early hours, low and mournful, and somehow not unkind. One more thread in the long layered sound of the city's nights. There is, in that picture, something that settles the mind rather than troubling it. The slow cart, the soft creak of the wheels, the low singing, the patient daily care of even the poorest and the most forgotten. Death in Noxus was never hidden or denied, and perhaps because of that it carried less terror than it might. It was simply part of the round of things, gathered up each morning with patience and a song, and the city went on. And the slums, for all their hardness, had their own quiet life, the life of the poor everywhere, which is mostly invisible to the histories, and yet is most of what living actually is. There were the almshouses, where the sick and the old and the destitute found what shelter the city offered. There were the small fires in the evenings, around which the poor gathered to share what little they had. There were the children playing in the narrow lanes, who did not know they were poor, who simply played as children play everywhere, in whatever streets they are given. There were the small kindnesses that the poor show one another, the shared bread, the watched child, the sitting up with the sick, the quiet decencies that go on at the bottom of every hard society and are never written down. Life in the slums was hard and short and often cruel, and we do not pretend otherwise. And yet it was life, full and human, with its loves and its small joys and its ordinary days, lived out beneath the walls of the great empire by people the empire mostly forgot. And there is a tenderness owed to them, to all the uncounted poor who lived and died in the shadow of the bastion, going about their small, brave lives in the dark at the empire's feet. Picture the slums in the deep of the night, when even the hardest day is done. The small fires burn down to embers, the narrow lanes quiet and dark, the almshouses still, their sleepers resting. The pyres at the city's edge burned low, their slow smoke rising into the night, and through it all the same deep quiet that settles over every place where people sleep, rich or poor, high or low, the great leveling quiet of the night, in which a beggar and an emperor sleep under the same dark sky, and are, for those few hours, very nearly the same. The tallymen would begin their rounds again before dawn, as they always did, and the hard day would come again, as it always did. And yet for now, in the deep of the night, even the poorest quarter of the empire lay quiet and at rest, and the low laments had fallen silent, and there was only the dark, and the embers, and the slow smoke, and the sleeping, and the patient turning of the night toward another morning. In time, the story drifts out of the city altogether, onto the long roads that ran between the empire's far places, and these roads at dusk are about the gentlest scene the whole empire offers. Every road that led into a Noxian territory ended, somewhere along its length, in a Nox Torah, one of the great dark arches of stone that marked the land as the empire's own. They stood at the approaches to the conquered cities, tall and dark against the sky, named in the old tongue, gateways to Noxus. By day they were stern things, meant to remind every traveler who held the land. And yet at dusk, with the light going amber and then gray, with the dry wind moving over the country and the day's heat slowly lifting, a Nox Torah on a quiet road was simply a great dark shape against the fading sky, with the road running on beneath it and away into the gathering evening, and a traveler passing under it in the last light would hear only the wind and their own footsteps and the deep settled silence of the open country at the end of a day. The countryside of the empire was a patchwork, as varied as the conquests that had made it. There were the stony hill farms of Trevalo in the west, where the fields clung to rocky slopes, and the work was hard and plain, and the rhythms were the old, slow rhythms of planting and tending and harvest, far from any arena or any war. There were the cold iron fortresses of the north, like Delverhold against the iron spike foothills, where the deep mines ran down into the dark, and the ore came up slowly, and the cold of the mountains lay over everything. There were the mineral plains of Rockrund in the south, their hills worked for ore and powder, wide and open under a big sky. There were the sea cliffs and harbors of the eastern coast, where the salt wind came in off the water. And far to the south, across the desert, the coastal cities of Shurima held their slow coexistence. Noxian and Shuriman together, the salt trade of Urzaris moving through warm harbors, the long, warm evenings settling over streets where two old cultures had learned, without much fuss, to share a home. And in the far north, on the wide, barren steppes of the southern Freljord, there were the old battlegrounds where Darius and his veterans had fought their long stalemate years before, against an enemy that would not break. Those steppes were empty country now, mostly, wind-scoured and cold and open, the kind of place where a battle is fought and lost and won, and then, in a few seasons, the grass grows back over it, and the wind moves through it, and there is nothing left to say that anyone was ever there at all. The Empire's edges were full of such places, old fields gone quiet, where the loud history had passed through once and then moved on, leaving only the wind and the long grass and the slow forgetting. Let us follow the long roads a little further, slowly, for the roads of the Empire ran through some of its quietest country, and there is nothing more restful than a long road through quiet country at the end of a day. The great roads of Noxus, laid down by the Warmasons over the centuries, ran straight and patient across the whole reach of the Empire, binding the far provinces to the capital and to one another. On them moved the slow traffic of an empire at peace, the merchant trains hauling goods between the provinces, the tax carts bringing the empire's due toward the capital, the columns of recruits marching the other way toward their war hosts, the messengers, the pilgrims, the ordinary travelers going about ordinary lives. A road like that has its own slow life, its way stations and its inns, its long, empty stretches where a traveler might walk for hours, seeing no one but the wind and the grass and a far line of hills. And in the evening, when the day's traffic thinned and the light went golden and then gray, those long roads grew very quiet, the dust settling, the last carts pulling off to the way stations for the night, the empty road running on ahead into the gathering dark, toward a dark arch somewhere at the edge of the next province, toward a town with its small lights coming on, toward sleep. Think of a traveler on such a road at dusk, somewhere in the wide middle country of the Empire, walking the last mile toward a town before full dark, the day's heat lifting off the land, the sky going from gold to gray to the first deep blue of evening, the first stars coming out over the eastern hills, the dark shape of a Noxtora rising ahead against the fading light, marking the town's edge, and beyond it the small warm scatter of lamps where people were settling in for the night, banking their fires, putting their children to bed, drawing the day to its close. There is nothing dramatic in such a scene, nothing to follow, nothing at stake. There is only the quiet end of an ordinary day in an ordinary place in a great old empire, the road and the arch and the small lights and the coming dark, and the slow settling of everything toward rest. Think of the small towns themselves in the deep provinces, the ones no history ever names, where the great events of the empire arrived only as distant rumor, a tale carried by a traveler, a name on a tax form, a new banner that changed little. Life in such a town turned on its own small axis, the seasons and the harvests, the births and the marriages and the deaths, the market on its appointed day, the old quarrels and the old friendships, the whole quiet human round that goes on everywhere, under every empire, regardless of which banner flies over the square. The people of such towns lived and died mostly in peace, mostly unbothered by the loud history and their lives, uncounted, and unremembered, were the true vast body of the empire, the great quiet mass of ordinary living over which the bright, loud events played out like weather over a deep, calm sea. And think of the far cold steppes of the Freljord again, the empty wind-scoured country in the north, where the old battles had been fought and forgotten. The grass had grown back over the battlefields, as grass does, and the wind moved through it endlessly, and the few hardy people of that country went about their lives in the cold as they always had, and the old wars were just stories now, just names, just a few rusted things turned up sometimes in the turf. There is a deep peace in such places, the peace of country that has seen its violence and outlasted it, where the wind and the grass and the slow seasons have patiently erased what the armies did, and there is nothing left but the long open land and the moving air and the great quiet that comes when even the memory of trouble has finally blown away. Through all of this vast and varied country, the empire held together by its roads and its arches and its stewards and its slow, patient absorption of everyone it took. The forges in the capital burned on, and the arenas filled and emptied, and the tallymen made their rounds. And the desert songs drifted by the water, and the great obsidian wolf sat on in its open tower, and the wealthy slept in their lampless quarter. And over it all lay the same hard old idea that had founded the nation, that strength is the only thing that lasts, worn now into the very stones of the place, so old and so settled that hardly anyone thought about it anymore, the way one does not think about the ground one stands on. It was simply Noxus, simply the way of things, an old empire breathing slowly in the dark, neither rising sharply nor falling sharply, just continuing, the way old things do. Let us stay a while longer in the slow texture of the place, for there is no hurry to leave it, and the deeper one settles into the ordinary rhythms of the empire, the quieter the mind becomes. There were the daily rituals of the city, the things that happened over and over, year upon year, until they were simply the shape of life. There were the arenas, where the reckoners fought, and these had become both a punishment and the great entertainment of the people, ever since Draven had turned them into spectacle. The fighters took on names and personas and costumes, and rivalries grew between them, and the crowds came to know them and to favor them, the way crowds everywhere come to love their champions. Some of these fighters had been foreign-born, captured in distant wars, and had won their fame and sometimes their freedom with their hands in the sand of the pits. There was a Minotaur clan leader, taken in the southern campaigns, the last of his people, who fought in the arenas and endured. There was a captured eastern sailor who became a celebrated arena fighter under a borrowed name before eventually winning free. The arenas were hard places, and we will not dwell on their crueler matches, but they were also, in their way, the beating loud heart of the city's common life, where on any given evening the people gathered together under the torches to watch and roar and forget their own hard days for an hour or two. There was the constant work of the forges, which never stopped. The dark steel came down from the iron spike mines and out of Delverhold's deep tunnels, and in the capital it was worked endlessly into the Empire's gear. And the weapons and armor that came from those forges shared the same severe aesthetic as the city itself. All sharp, simple function, intentionally plain, even intentionally ugly. A Noxian axe might have a hooked handle, made so to drag a rider down from a horse. A Noxian breastplate was slab-faced and heavy and unlovely, built to turn a blow and nothing more. There was no ornament for ornament's sake, no beauty sought for beauty. The Empire made its tools to work, and the working was their only grace. and there is a kind of restful honesty in that, in things made plainly to do plain hard jobs, with no pretense about them at all. There were newer things being folded in, too, crude experiments still finding their place. There were black powder weapons, loud and dangerous and not yet trusted, brought up from the mineral south. There were the strange chemical devices out of distant zone, the chemtech that had done such terrible work in Ionia, still being uneasily integrated into the Empire's ways. These were the rough edges of an old empire learning new tricks, and they sat awkwardly beside the dark steel and the honest ugly axes, the way new things always sit awkwardly beside old ones for a while, until they too become familiar and old. There were the funerals, which in Noxus were loud, for the Empire did not hide its dead or grieve them in silence. There were the soldiers' rites, and the pyres, and the laments. And over all the spirits of the dead, the people set the wolf, the wild half of kindred, honored above the gentle lamb. For Noxus loved the fierce thing better than the soft one, even in death, even at the end. And running beneath all of it, holding the whole vast machine together, was the great unglamorous work of administration. The stewards in their provinces and the clerks in their offices and the tally of taxes and recruits and grain. The bureaucracy that the Empire itself, in a rare, quiet moment of self-knowledge, called its own lifeblood. For all its arenas and its war hosts and its dark arches, an empire that size ran day to day on records and ledgers, and the patient labor of people whose names no story remembers. And there is something restful in that thought, too. The great loud history floating always on a deep, still sea of ordinary paperwork and ordinary people doing ordinary jobs, keeping the lights on, or in Mortora, keeping them off, year after year after year. There is more to say, slowly, about the small daily life of the Empire, the ordinary things that filled the long stretches between the wars, and these are gentle things to dwell on as the night deepens. There were the markets of the capital, which by day were a great churning of the whole Empire's goods and peoples. Into them came the salt and fish of the eastern coast, the iron and gold of the northern mines, the grain of the western farms, the spices and cloth of the southern desert trade, the strange wares of the conquered provinces, all of it flowing into the heart of the Empire to be bought and sold and argued over. The languages of a dozen conquered lands mingled in those markets, and the faces of as many peoples, for the Empire had drawn them all in over the centuries, and a person standing in a capital market on a busy morning would hear the whole reach of Noxus in the noise of it, the haggling and the calling and the clatter of carts on stone. And then, in the evening, it would all wind down, the stalls coming apart, the goods packed away, the great square slowly emptying, until by deep night it stood quiet and bare under the rooftops, swept and still, waiting for the morning to fill it again. There was the craft of the dark arches, the Noxtaraha, raised at the mouth of every conquered road. They were quarried from the dark stone of the mountains around the capital, and hauled out to the far provinces, and raised there by the Warmasons with great labor, and each was named in the old Ur-Nox tongue, the deep root language of the Empire from which the very name of Noxus came. To raise one was a long, slow work of stone and engineering, of cutting and hauling and fitting great dark blocks until the arch stood complete across the road. And once it stood, it would stand for centuries, weathering slowly, becoming part of the landscape, until the people of the province forgot a time before it had been there. There are few things more patient than a great arch of stone standing over a road, asking nothing, doing nothing, simply marking the way. while generations of travelers pass beneath it, and the seasons weather its dark face and the long years go by. There was the severe beauty, if it can be called beauty, of the things the Empire made. Its weapons and its armor, its buildings and its arches all shared one aesthetic: plain and hard and unadorned, sharp, simple lines, function placed always before ornament. A Noxian made a thing to do its work, and made it well, and did not trouble to make it pretty. And over time this plainness became its own kind of style, an austere, severe look that was recognizably Noxian wherever it appeared. The gray and the red and the black, the dark steel, the slab-faced stone, the hooked and practical shapes. There was an honesty in it, a refusal of pretense, a sense that a thing should simply be what it was and do what it did. And to a certain eye, there was even a quiet grandeur in that, in the plain, hard honesty of a people who made everything to last and nothing to charm. There was the old belief in the spirit kindred, the two-faced spirit of death, a lamb and a wolf together, and the Noxian love of the wolf above the lamb. Other peoples, it was said, prayed to the gentle lamb for a quiet passing, a soft release at the end. And yet Noxus honored the wolf, the wild hunting half, the half that ran down its quarry and took it fiercely. For that was the death the Empire understood, the death that came in strength and in the chase, not the death that came softly in a quiet bed. And so the great shrine in the capital was raised to the wolf, and the people honored the wolf in their rites. And even in death the Empire kept its hard old face, preferring the fierce thing to the gentle one, the hunter to the released. And yet the lamb was there too, always the other half of the same spirit, the quiet half waiting patiently beside the wild one. For the two were never truly separate, and even the fiercest death ended in the end in the same long stillness as the gentlest. There was the weather of the Empire, hot and dry on most nights in the capital, the wind carrying coal smoke from the forges and salt from the distant sea. There were the rare cold nights, when something colder came down from the northern mountains and the people drew closer to their fires. There were the long, warm nights of the southern provinces, and the cold, deep nights of the northern mines, and the still nights of the western farms under a wide country sky. And there was, every morning, everywhere across the whole vast empire, the slow coming of the dawn, the sky paling in the east over the eastern ports first, and then later over the inland cities, and later still over the western hills. The light creeping westward across the empire as the world turned, touching the dark arches and the stone wolf and the empty market squares and the quiet farms one after another. The same slow dawn that had come every morning since before the empire was, and would come every morning long after it was gone. This was the texture of the empire then, layered and old and settled, the forges breathing and the arenas filling and emptying, the tally men on their rounds and the desert songs drifting by the water, the great wolf seated in its open tower and the lampless quarter dark behind its walls, the dark arches standing at the ends of the long roads, the hill farms and the cold mines and the warm southern harbors, the loud funerals and the quiet ledgers, an old empire doing the same old things, slowly in the dark, the way it had for centuries, and the way it would for a good while yet. Before the story turns toward its last stillnesses, let us rest a while longer simply in the quiet hours of the empire, in the ordinary peace of its nights. For the deepest part of a long night is the right place for the gentlest things. Think of all the sleepers of the empire on a single quiet night, all across its vast reach, all at once. In the capital, the thousands behind the black rooftops, the soldiers and the smiths and the market folk and the children, settled into sleep in the twisting old streets. In the eastern ports, the fishers resting before the early tide, the boats rocking gently at their moorings in the dark. In the western hill farms, the weathered families asleep in their small stone houses, the fields lying quiet under the stars. In the northern mines, the miners resting from the deep, dark work, the cold settling over the fortress. In the southern desert cities, the people sleeping through the warm night, the desert quiet beyond the walls. All of them, across the whole empire, the millions of ordinary lives settled into the same darkness, the same sleep, on the same quiet night. There is something vast and gentle in the thought of it. All those sleepers, the whole great population of an empire gone quiet together in the dark, breathing slowly, resting, each in their own small place, under the same turning sky. Think of the watches kept through those nights, the few who stayed awake while the many slept, the legionnaires on the great stairway, standing still in the torchlight, the smiths at the never-cooling forges, working the iron through the dark hours, the tallymen beginning their rounds before dawn, the night watchmen on the crenellated rooftops, looking out over the sleeping city, the bakers waking in the small hours to start the day's bread, the shepherds in the far provinces, keeping their flocks under the stars. There are always a few awake while the world sleeps, keeping the small, quiet vigils that let the rest easy. And there is a kind of tenderness in that too, in the watchers who hold the night so the sleepers need not. The way one stays quietly awake a little while beside someone who has just fallen asleep, simply to be there, simply to keep the dark company. Think of how the empire, for all its hardness, was held together at bottom by these small, ordinary human things, the work and the rest, the watching and the sleeping, the daily round repeated across 1,000 years and 10,000 places. The histories remember the warlords and the coups and the great battles, the loud, bright moments at the surface. And yet beneath all of that, holding it up, was the deep, slow body of ordinary life, the sleeping and the waking, the working and the resting, the births and the deaths, the seasons turning over the fields, the tides coming in and going out, the dawn arriving every morning across the whole wide empire. That was the real Noxus in the end. Not the wars, but the long, quiet living between them. The vast, patient body of ordinary days over which the bright, loud history played and passed. And it is into that deep quiet, the quiet beneath all the noise, that we now let the story finally settle. In time, as our long night draws toward its end, the story turns one last time, away from the busy texture of the living city and toward the longest and stillest things in all of Noxus, the great unmoving eras, the deep sleeps within the Empire's history, where almost nothing happens at all for very long stretches of time, and where the mind, by now grown drowsy, can rest most easily of all. Think back first to the warrior Sion, the old hero who had killed a king with his bare hands and died in the same moment, and whose body was carried home with the king's crown still in his grip. After they laid him in his great monument within the bastion, he simply lay there, entombed beneath his own towering statue, for half a century. 50 years, more or less, of complete stillness. The city went on around him. The forges burned, the arenas roared, emperors schemed and war hosts marched, and through all of it, the old hero lay unmoving in the dark of his tomb, a stone figure above a still body, while half a century passed over him like slow water over a stone. There is something almost peaceful in imagining it, that long, unbroken rest in the cool dark, 50 years of quiet beneath the busy city, the great statue keeping its silent watch above, season after season after season, with nothing asked of him and nothing required, only the long stillness going on and on. There is more to that long rest of his, if we follow it gently. For Sion was not left in peace forever. In the middle of an emperor's reign, as we heard long ago, the old hero was dragged back from his half-century of stillness, woken by blood magic into a body that no longer knew him. And the thing that rose was not the hero, but a half-aware engine of violence that had to be bound again in chains. We will not dwell on his waking, for it was not gentle. And so think instead of what came before it, and what the empire took from him. He had earned his rest. He had killed a king and died for it, and been carried home in honor and laid beneath his statue. And for 50 quiet years, he had been allowed simply to be still. And then that stillness was broken, and he was made to be a weapon again, and bound, and later loosed once more upon a rebellious city. A hero used and used again, long past the point where any hero should have been let go. There is a sadness in that, the sadness of a rest disturbed, of a stillness that should have been left whole. And perhaps the kindest thing we can do for him in this quiet telling is to remember him as he was in those 50 peaceful years, before the waking, lying still and honored in the cool dark beneath his statue, the king's crown in his stone hand at rest, the way he should have been left. And there were other long stillnesses woven all through the empire's history, if one looks for the quiet places between the loud events. Consider the immortal bastion itself, the great ancient fortress at the heart of everything, and how long it has simply stood. It was raised by the Iron Revenant in that far distant age, more than 15 centuries past, and it has stood ever since, through everything. It sheltered the tribes through the ancient wars, as we heard at the beginning, and then it became the heart of the new nation, and then the seat of the emperors, and then, after the coup, the home of the three. Empires of stone are patient things. The bastion saw the founding and the first wars and the long rise of the empire, saw Sion carried home and entombed within it, saw emperors crowned and emperors fall, saw the throne shattered and left empty, and through all of it, it simply stood, its thick old walls weathering slowly, its dark stone darkening further with the centuries. There is a deep steadiness in a thing that old, that has outlasted everyone who ever lived in it, and will outlast everyone living in it now. A fortress that has watched 1,500 years go by and stands ready, in its patient stone way, to watch 1,500 more. To think of it is to feel how brief a single life is, and how brief even a long reign against the long, quiet endurance of old stone, and there is rest in that thought. The rest of knowing that the old, strong things will go on holding long after we have let go. Consider, too, the long, quiet life of the ancient Vladimir, the blood mage in his lampless house in Mortaria. He had lived more than 1,000 years, and most of those years had not been filled with great events. He surfaced when the times were interesting, the old accounts say, and he withdrew when they were dull, and the dull times were many and long. Imagine the stretches of those centuries when nothing in particular was happening, when he simply lived, quietly, in his dark, grand house, keeping his written chronicles so as not to lose the thread of his own endless memory, watching the empire change slowly around him, in no hurry at all, having all the time there has ever been. There is a strange restfulness in a life that long and that patient, in the picture of the ageless man at his writing in the dark, with nothing pressing, with no deadline that could ever matter, simply setting down the days as they passed and waiting, without urgency, for the next interesting age to come around. And consider the great obsidian wolf in its open tower, the 50-foot statue seated in the wind. It had sat there through every season, by day and by night, through heat and through the rare cold, through the loud years and the quiet ones, looking out over the city with its still stone eyes. A statue keeps a kind of time that nothing living can keep, an utter patience, a stillness that outlasts every person who ever pauses to look at it. The wolf had seen, in its blind stone way, emperors rise and fall, the throne shatter and stand empty, the city grow and burn and rebuild, and through all of it, it had simply sat, unmoved, seated in its open-sided tower in the moving air, as still at the end of a long age as it had been at the beginning. And consider the empty throne itself in the great audience chamber, standing broken and unsat since the night of the coup. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for Swain to take it, to sit himself down in the old seat of the emperors and be crowned. He chose not to, and the throne was left to stand exactly as the coup had left it, shattered and vacant, a thing to be looked at rather than used. And so it has stood, through all the years since, in the cool, dim vastness of the chamber, while the three rule from their marble table at its foot. A throne with no one on it is a strange and quiet monument, a piece of furniture turned into an idea, and this one keeps its long, still vigil over the great empty hall, meaning, to anyone who looks at it, that the age of single rulers is over and will not come again. There is a stillness to it that is almost peaceful, the broken seat in the dark, asking nothing, holding no one, simply standing through the long, quiet years as a reminder set in stone and shadow. And consider the dark arches, the Noxtora, standing at the mouths of all the conquered roads across the whole reach of the empire. Each was raised once, with great labor, and then left to stand, and standing is all an arch ever does. Through the long years they weathered slowly, their dark stone darkening, their old carved names wearing soft, while beneath them passed generation after generation of travelers, merchants, and soldiers, and pilgrims, and ordinary folk, most of whom never gave the great arch over their heads a second thought. The arches did not need the thought. They simply stood, patient as the hills, marking the ways into the empire, holding their silent posts at the edges of the provinces through every season and every reign, asking nothing of anyone, enduring. To picture them all at once, scattered across the whole vast empire, each standing alone over its quiet road in the dark, is to feel something very calm, a whole reach of patient stone keeping its long, still watch over the sleeping land. These are the deep, still places of the empire's long history, the sheltering generations in the bastion, the patient centuries of the ageless man, the unmoving watch of the great stone wolf, the half-century rest of the entombed hero, the broken throne in its dim hall, the dark arches over their quiet roads. They are the parts of the story where time itself seems to slow and pool, where almost nothing happens for a very long while, and where the only thing to do is to drift along with that slowness, gently, asking nothing, the way the city itself drifts through its quietest hours before dawn. Consider the long, quiet eras of the provinces, too, the stretches of years in which nothing happened that any history would trouble to record. For every dramatic conquest, there were decades of simple having, of a province sitting quietly under its steward, paying its taxes, raising its sons into the war hosts, bringing in its harvests, burying its dead, year after unremarkable year. The histories remember the takings and the rebellions, the loud, bright moments, and pass over all the long, ordinary time between them. And yet it was in that long, ordinary time that most people actually lived. A child born in a quiet decade in a quiet province might live a whole long life and die old without ever seeing a battle, knowing the empire only as the distant order of things, the law and the road and the arch at the town's edge, and such lives, uncounted and unrecorded, filled the great calm spaces between the events that the stories remember. There is a deep restfulness in thinking of them, all those quiet, untroubled years, the long, peaceful stretches that no one bothered to write down precisely because nothing happened in them worth the ink. Consider the slow turning of the seasons over the empire's far lands, the same turning year upon year, century upon century. The planting and the harvest in the western hills, the long cold and the brief thaw in the northern mines, the unchanging heat of the southern desert, where the seasons barely turned at all, the tides coming in and going out along the eastern coast, twice each day, every day, for all the long history of the empire, and long before it, and long after. These were the deepest rhythms of all, deeper than any emperor or any war, the slow, patient turning of the natural year that went on beneath all the loud human history, indifferent to it, older than it, and far more lasting. Empires rise and fall, the old saying goes, and the saying is true, but the rain falls and the sun crosses and the seasons turn regardless. And there is a great calm in remembering that, in feeling how small and brief even a 1,000-year empire is against the long, slow breathing of the world that holds it. And now we come, at the very last, to the oldest and longest stillness of all, the one we began with, all those hours ago, when the night was younger. For the Iron Revenant, Mordekaiser, was never truly destroyed. When LeBlanc and Vladimir and the tribes severed his soul from his dark armor and sealed the empty shell, they did not end him. They only sent him away. His soul withdrew from the world entirely, to a distant spirit realm, a quiet far place called Mitna Rachnan, and there it remained. And there, for all the long centuries since, it has simply been gathering strength in no particular hurry, with all the deep patience of a thing that has already waited 300 years in life and is willing to wait far longer in death. Imagine that, as the last picture of the night. A distant, quiet realm, far from the world and all its noise. The forges of Noxus burning 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away. The arenas roaring, the empires rising and falling, and none of it touching that far still place at all. And in it, the old warlord's soul, settled and unhurried, gathering nothing in particular, in no rush to return, simply waiting. The way deep water waits behind a dam, the way winter waits beneath the autumn, the way anything waits when it has learned that there is no need to hurry, because it has already outlasted everything and will outlast a great deal more. There is no urgency in that distant realm. There is no alarm. There is only the long, patient, settled stillness of something resting in a quiet, far place, gathering itself slowly in the dark, in no hurry at all to wake. Think of how far away that realm is, and how quiet. The whole loud world of Noxus, the forges and the arenas and the wars and the schemes, all of it as distant from that still place as a storm is distant from the deep floor of the sea, where the water never moves and the storm never reaches, and there is only the dark and the cold and the long, unbroken quiet. The warlord's soul rests there, in that deep, still place, gathering itself with the patience of something that has forgotten how to be in a hurry, that has all the time there has ever been and will ever be. There is no urgency in that realm, and no alarm, and no morning coming. There is only the long, settled stillness, going on and on, the way deep water goes on, the way the dark between the stars goes on, the way anything goes on when it has finally and completely come to rest. And so the long story of the Empire comes to rest there, as all stories must come to rest somewhere, in the quietest and stillest place it has, in a far realm where nothing presses and nothing hurries, and there is all the time in the world. The forges of Noxus will burn on. The tallymen will make their rounds in the morning. The great wolf will keep its stone watch. The desert songs will drift again by the water tomorrow night, as they did tonight. And the old empire will go on breathing slowly in the dark, as it always has, neither rising nor falling now, just continuing, settled and old and quiet, while the night holds it gently and asks nothing of it at all. There is nothing more to follow, and nothing more that needs to be told. The story has wound down to its stillness, the way a fire winds down to its embers, and there is only the quiet left now, and the warmth, and the long, easy dark. Rest now. Let it all drift away. The Empire will keep on without any watching, as it has for 1,000 years and more. Sleep well.